Carter for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. This is certainly a, a serious problem, particularly in the state of Georgia. Georgia is the #1 forestry state in the nation. As you know, we have over 22 million acres of privately owned land and only about 1.7 million acres of government land. So we're a little bit different from, I think, the scenario that exists out west. However, we've had our share of fires. We had the West Mims fires. The Okefenokee Swamp is in my district. It is truly one of the national treasures of our country. It is a beautiful, beautiful area that I've had the opportunity to visit on numerous occasions. But we had a very serious fire there this past year, the West Mims fire. And one of the adjacent property owners to that was telling me about this, and I met with him because he lost a lot of land as a result of the fire that started on the swamp but spread to his private land. And I'll start with you, Mr. Bearchigger, because I see that you worked as a fire training instructor and a national Type 3 incident commander. And I just wanted to ask you, one of the things that was brought to my attention by the private landowner was that they didn't utilize the air support. If they had been able to utilize it quicker, that they could have contained it possibly. Now, in all fairness, a swamp fire is a little bit different than other kind of fires because you have from what I understand, and I know y'all know it a lot better than I do, but the peat moss, and it's hard to put out because the water has to rise up. And again, you understand it much better than I do, but he did make that point that if, and he attributes it to being a problem with whether it was low funding and they couldn't afford to utilize the air support, the helicopters that were available. Is this something that you've experienced before?
Well, there could be, I wasn't there.
Right.
I don't know what the conditions were, and certain tools work good under certain conditions. If you have a wind blowing in excess of, say, 20 miles an hour, aviation stuff really doesn't help you much. And swamp is tough because you can't use dozers and other mechanical equipment because they don't go through the swamp very well. So there's challenges with every fire. But the example you give is very good, is every forest in this country is exposed to catastrophic wildfire. And our history shows that, going back to 1812 with the great Maine and New Brunswick fire. Who would have thought that northern Maine and Brunswick would burn up, I think it was 3 million acres and kill a lot of people. So, it's hard for me to comment on a fire that I don't have any specifics, but not all the tools work all the time, sir. And in Oregon this year, landowners lost 33,000 acres of private timberlands from fires burning off of the Forest Service onto the private lands.
Well, let me ask you, I met with him, as I mentioned before, and he owns a lot of forest land in the area in Georgia. And when I met with him, he said that, a lightning strike is what this originated from, and that generally the federal government will just let it burn out and not even respond to it. Is that?
It just depends where it is, and if I believe you mentioned it was in a wilderness.
Yeah, it was in the middle of the swamp, or at least it started. Now it spread, onto the private land.
In wilderness comes certain engagement rules, and I think some of that needs to be reviewed.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Let me move to. I wanted to get to Ms. German. I'm sorry, Ms.
German, yeah.
German, I'm sorry, excuse me. Okay, I wanted to ask you, now you're in Montana, right?
Yes.
Okay. The practices in Montana, I suspect, are a little bit different than as I described in the state of Georgia, particularly in the swamp, and I ask about that in my district. Now, we're not all swamp in Georgia, but in my district we are. I'm in South Georgia, so. But I wanted to ask you about the practice, the forestry practices that you have in Montana. Can you describe those very quickly?
Sure, absolutely. So we have, I'll say that 60% of the forested land within the state of Montana is managed by the Forest Service. And we have active forest management taking place on state, private, and federal lands. And anything else that you want to know
I
about
wanted to ask you
that?
specific about the state implementation plans, and I guess this is kind of a broad question, I'm out of time, but nevertheless, these have to be approved by the EPA, is that the way I understand it?
Yeah, and I don't have extra expertise on the state implementation plans. I might ask that my colleague from Idaho asked.
I was just wondering if there are any kind of barriers that you're having or any kind of constraints, and how soon do they approve those? How quickly do they approve them?
Quickly, please.
Yeah, it normally takes an 18-month period for EPA to approve those. So any changes to like Idaho rules, we submit for EPA. It's a very long, drawn-out process.
Good. Okay.
Gentleman's
Thank you very
time's
much. And I
expired.
yield.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.